Hello everyone, welcome back. Scarlett here again with the next installment of Tormented Past. And today we'll be starting on Chapter 5, Losing Hope. Let's jump right in. James was focused on finishing school. During his senior year, James started dating Myra, one of his fellow students. She was a beautiful girl who had caught James's attention while he was with Tanya. With Tanya out of the picture, he thought he might ask her out. Daniel points out to James that this is something unusual for James because the only person he genuinely cares about is Tanya, and Myra isn't anything like Tanya. This will only lead to pain and suffering, as Myra was falling hard for James, and despite caring about her, James didn't feel the same way. Myra was a deeply religious girl, something different from what James was accustomed to. He was completely different from what she had expected in a first boyfriend. She liked James for his cockiness, but wasn't a fan of his fighting and putting his body and health on the line every time he walked into the ring. James treated Myra completely differently than Tanya. Since she didn't care for his fighting, James would spend time training and away from Myra. This led to her feel that James wasn't interested in her and that she was an outsider in her own relationship. She wanted to improve things no matter the cost. She so considered reaching out to the one person who understood James better than anyone, despite it killing her to do so. Even though James was no longer in a relationship with Tanya, Myra always felt uncomfortable about and even started to resent Tanya for no real reason. She felt that at some point, James would go back to Tanya. James would try to reassure her that his relationship with Tanya was over, but it would be a lie if he were to say he didn't care about her. James admits that what drew him towards Myra was how beautiful she made it look to be smart. He's also aware that they weren't meant to last forever since they're from two different worlds, and it wouldn't be fair to either one of them to be pulled from their lives. Daniel tells him it might be best for them to go their own ways before either of them gets too attached. It would be much harder for Myra than it would be for James. Daniel looks on while James contemplates what to do next as they head back to James's house. Upon arriving at the house, the boys notice that Marcus is there with Hannah. Waiting for them to arrive, James recalls Marcus saying, "I have some news which is best done in person. It's a family affair, and I would have done it as soon as I found out, but there wasn't a good time, including now. But there's never the right time for something like this." Confused, James tells Marcus to stop beating around the bush and to spit it out, but since it's a family matter, where's William, so they can all deal with it together. With tears starting to roll down his face, Marcus looks at James and Daniel. They're confused, and Marcus breaks down and finally says William was murdered earlier today. On hearing the news, James reacts as he did when John passed. He immediately shuts down emotionally. Daniel pulls Marcus and James into a hug, but James is non-reactive as the pack embraces. Knowing what will follow, Hannah calls out to James, but there's no answer. Marcus and Daniel try to get James out of his trance, but to no avail. Paul and Anastasia walk up to the villa and see James is not acting like himself. Paul asks Daniel what was going on. In the middle of their conversation, James snaps back to reality. Fully aware that his grandparents don't care about anyone else other than their own, James tells them it doesn't concern them and it will be best for them to leave before his emotions erupt and they feel his rage once more. Trying to put James at ease, Paul tries to hug James, but he extends his arm onto Paul's right shoulder, keeping him at bay, saying, "It's not the time for some bullcrap, go away." James sees Anastasia talking to Daniel. Once she locks eyes with James, she begins to walk away while calling Paul to her side. Overcome by the news, James tells Marcus and Daniel to leave. He wants to be alone with his thoughts. He specifically doesn't want Daniel to hear him, as Daniel appears to value a relationship with Paul and Anastasia a little too much. The thought of Daniel stabbing the pack in the back has crossed James's mind on several occasions, and he can't deal with that now. Marcus says, "You shouldn't be alone at a time like this. It's a effed up situation, and we're brothers. I need you just as much as you need me." Before James can reply, almost as if he read James's mind, Daniel interjects, saying, "The only reason I continue to talk to your grandparents is because they are family, and despite how they've treated you, they've always treated me with respect." With a joyless grin, James looked at Daniel, saying, "Go seek the old lady then. I don't need a brother. The only thing I want right now is to be alone." Daniel walks away, and James looked over at Marcus and says, "The next time something like this happens, don't wait to tell me. You both know where to find me, always. I'll drop the weight of the world on the bee who did this." Marcus nods in agreement and realizes that James is already tapping into the darkness inside. He can see how the dark wolf will be the one thing that's needed to avenge William's death. Leaving him, James heads to the beach. Its beauty and peaceful scenery will help him gather his thoughts and clear his mind before allowing the darkness to consume him. Alone on the beach, it occurs to him that he's dependent on his pack and doesn't want to lose any more of them and doesn't want to keep starting over. While he's mulling over these thoughts, a man walks up to him. Although James has no idea who the man is, the man clearly knows him and smiles while starting to talk about William and how much of a coward he was and deserving of his fate. Enraged, James stands up, not thinking twice about what he wants to do. The man, an imposing 7 feet, which towers over James, extends his hand to formally introduce himself, saying that he's heard there's something special about James. He would like to take a close look at what the hype about this dark wolf is all about. Despite his grief, James is intrigued and tells the man he doesn't know what has been said, but that he's not in the mood for an exhibition. The man should consider himself lucky and leave while he still can. If it's a fight that he's interested in and persists, then it will be his last. Not to be intimidated, he continues by giving James his name, Dustin, and explains his reason for being at the beach today. "I know this may come as a surprise for you, but there's one person who wants to see you and your friends meet your end. That's why I killed William. It wasn't personal. The reward was just too great to pass up." James doesn't recall ever personally crossing paths with Dustin in his fights and believes he is telling the truth about the reward. James isn't intimidated by Dustin's size, knowing that there are a number of techniques to take care of someone so large. Not afraid to seize the opportunity for vengeance of his friend's death, he warns Dustin one last time to make sure this is something he wants to do and is willing to die for. Dustin smirks at the notion and tells James that the only reason he continues to give warning is that he's hoping for a change of heart and peace within the family. Amused, James responds by saying, "You can't say you weren't warned. Now make the first move." Accepting the invitation, James throws a few punches and widely misses. James laughs and tells him to be serious and try harder. Anger rising, Dustin rushes at James, attempting to knock him out with a fury of punches and kicks, but he misses again. Frustration begins to set in as it appears that James is far superior in skill than he had estimated. Dustin reaches into his back pocket and tries to pull out a gun, but James notices and spears Dustin into a palm tree. James grabs the dropped gun and throws it out of reach. He doesn't want to kill Dustin, not yet anyway. Even though he murdered William, he watches Dustin on the sand, spitting out some of the sand that got in his mouth. Arrogance is skyrocketing within James, and he decides to toy with Dustin. Taking advantage of the power and youth he has over the man, he begins to heave and slam him to the ground, forcing him to eat sand repeatedly. Furious over his humiliation and seeing James approaching him once more, James grabs a handful of sand. Just as James was about to lift Dustin off the ground, throws the sand into James's eyes, blinding him temporarily. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he rushes to grab the gun, but when he turns around to fire a shot, James is nowhere in sight. He screams out for James to show himself while keeping the gun in front of him. Not getting a response, he starts walking and passes by a palm tree, seeing nothing beyond but open space. Passing another, he sees only a barrel but no James. After passing 5 trees, Dustin begins to lose faith in finding James and believes he ran away. With guard now down, Dustin passes another tree and James reappears, kicking Dustin in the back and knocking him to the ground once more. Grabbing him by the back of the neck, James rams Dustin into the palm tree head first, repeatedly, and Dustin starts to bleed profusely. James is enjoying the altercation until he notices that Dustin has stopped protecting his head. At that point, lifts Dustin up and power bombs him into the palm tree, causing Dustin to collapse onto the sand. James grabs the gun. Barely conscious, Dustin looks up at James, pointing the gun at him. James tells him that it's not his intention to kill him, but hurting him that will make things interesting for the entire pack. With that, Dustin musters every ounce of energy he has left and lunges himself at James, knocking him down to the ground. They start fighting over the gun. Dustin's aware that it's his only opportunity to take out James, when there's a shot fired, leaving them both looking up in shock. While they stare at each other, Dustin smirks and stands up to look down at James. James is shocked and confused, not knowing what to make of the situation. Then, after looking down at James for a few more seconds, Dustin falls backwards onto the sand. Holding the gun in his right hand, James stands up and looks down at Dustin, clutching his left rib cage. "Finish me off," Dustin says with a smirk. "I don't want to die so shamefully." While Dustin begs to die, James walks away down the beach to a dock, sits down, gun still in hand. No one thinks will never be the same after John's death. Followed by Michaels and Williams, he calmly lifts the gun to his right temple and closes his eyes. He feels at peace with himself, and he looks up at the sky and screams, "I'm okay with dying now." He can't get their images out of his head, and he hesitates. He knows they were all against suicide, but James is content with ending it here and now. There's no need to keep dragging out this life. He looks at the water and lifts the gun to his head once more when he hears Marcus in the background shouting his name. Marcus approaches James cautiously. Seeing James at such a low point in his life overwhelms him, but more so because James couldn't come to his brother and talk things out. Marcus begins to tell James that he's unlike anyone else he's ever encountered, and adds that regardless of what happens going forward, they will overlook this incident and keep it between them as long as James promises to let him in and talk about his issues through so they can work on a solution together. James nods in agreement. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 5. Next will be chapter 6, First Rebirth. Just remember, like, share, subscribe, keep coming back for more, and comment below. Let me know what you're thinking. Until next time, see y'all later. Bye.